Is a baby's life value dependent on whether or not it needs help to survive? Are Republicans owning themselves by posting clips of John Fettermen? And what is the cause of Tucker Carlson getting canned from Fox News? We look at these questions and more on this episode of Good Take, Bad Take. Hey friends, welcome to this episode of Good Take, Bad Take. This is the show where we go through our social media feeds. We find the most interesting takes, whether they're good or bad, and we break them down and try to highlight the good and the bad. My name is Donald, and I'm here with my co-host Britt. Before we get started, just a reminder to like and share and subscribe to our podcast. It helps us out a ton. Leaving a comment, all that good stuff helps us with the algorithm, and we appreciate all the feedback. You can follow us at Good Take, Bad Take Pod on Instagram and Good Bad Take Pod on Twitter and YouTube. Without further ado, we're going to go ahead and get started with this first take from Martha Bueno, who tweets, "A baby has a right to life when it no longer needs the mother to host that life. Do not equate a fully formed baby with a fetus. One needs a host, the other does not." What do you think about that take, Britt?
It's not good. This is a very bad take. I mean, have you watched the Bill Burr special at Red Rocks?
Yeah, I have.
Yeah, he's got this great bit in there about abortion and pro-life folks. He's like, on one hand, I understand it's a baby in a mother's womb and she should have the decision what to do. On the other hand, it's a baby, and people will say, well, no, it's not. It's a fetus. And he's like, well, if I baked a cake, I got all the ingredients, I mixed them all together, put it in a pan, heated the oven up, and then put it in the oven. When it's a 40-minute bake on the cake, and you came in and took the cake out at minute 20 and threw it across the floor, what the person would say is like, hey man, you ruined my cake. And that's a really funny way of illustrating that yeah, a fetus is, what type of fetus is it? It's a human fetus, right? Just because it's at a different stage in development does not make it any less what it actually is, right?
Exactly.
And so this argument, I remember we had in college for my debate class, we were on one side, we were on the pro-life side versus a pro-abortion side, pro-choice side. And I remember the other side was making this argument. I was like, look, if I dropped you in the jungle, your ability to be independent is really subjective, right? And because it's so objective, that means that you can't there needs to be something external that is objective that determines what is right or what is wrong. If I took one of there was a bunch of women on the other side that were making the pro-choice argument, which was ironic because they were really invested in it, even though this is a Christian school. And I was like, look, if I dropped you in the jungle, you would be pretty helpless, right? Because their whole point was oh, well, the baby's helpless, can't survive on its own. It's yeah, if I dropped you in the jungle, you'd be pretty helpless. I went on a safari in Africa, and they told me that if they dropped me out of the safari truck, I'd have about a 3% chance of making it back to, the safari camp without getting eaten or killed by some animal out there. I'd be pretty helpless myself. Obviously, helplessness, the ability to be independent, all those things are not indicative of whether a human should be killed or not. And it's the same in this case.
Yeah, I've always thought that this is such an odd way to try to set a moral standard for something. Because if you buy the premise that the value of a life, or even not even the value of the life, but the categorization of that life, right? Because they recognize it is alive, and they recognize that it has some kind of value. They just usually would argue that it's not a person or whatever. But if you're arguing that the personification or the actualization of a human is dependent on the host needs, you come up with a completely arbitrary, unrealistic standard that doesn't match with reality. It's one of those things where you can play how you like in sort of this in your mind in this ethereal game. Oh, well, once it no longer needs the host to survive, that's kind of your arbitrary distinction. But then when you realize that real life is a lot messier than that. Real life, babies get born prematurely and need to be hooked up to machines. And those babies have just as much a right to life as a baby who is born at a normal time and doesn't need to be hooked up to machines in order to live. It's also an absurd thing to think that an older individual who's hooked up to machines for their need to life, that their life no longer has value. These are intensely anti-human and anti-life policies and thought processes. And so it's it's one of those things where this kind of reasoning doesn't actually match with reality. It's only sort of a convenient little way to wrap a bow tie on your how you can justify holding to your pre-existing policy in sort of a philosophical, you know, in the hypothetical world, this is when it's okay to do things and this is when it's not. And then you look at the reality before you and you realize, no, life is much messier than that. And unless you're holding to an absolute standard of morality that demonstrates, one, when life is sacred, which is from conception, that's really the only consistent standpoint you can have, or and two, you also need a why life matters and is sacred for any of this to actually hold any water. I think that's one of those things where people generally pick up why life is valuable, and they have it sort of an intrinsic, what I would call natural law written on their hearts for that, but really without some sort of epistemology that informs why life is sacred, then it doesn't really matter when the baby has a right to life, because rights are something that a government grants you, and those could be arbitrarily changed at any point.
Yeah, and we would be horrified, including Martha Bueno, if we applied this standard at any other point for any other human. If you really want to extrapolate this to its inevitable conclusion, any type of human that inconvenience you or that becomes somewhat dependent upon you, does not matter if they're inside of you necessarily, but if they, if you are responsible for taking care of your mother or your father who is now at an age where they've got dementia or something like that, or let's say that you get fired from your job and you're no longer able to provide food, or maybe you broke your leg or something like this. It's like, well, you can make the argument that that person is dependent upon someone else, they can't survive on their own. Does that therefore give you the right to kill them, out of convenience sake? And we would all be horrified if that was the standard, but that's what this is, right? Like we are deciding that because a human life presents a potential inconvenience, we have a woman has the right to terminate that pregnancy and that human. And I would also like to point out that the reason people, like, they'll say, well, it's the woman's right to choose. They have a right to assume whether they want to have this burden put upon them. Ask yourself the question, why is it a burden? It's a burden because that fetus is going to become a human life outside of the womb. It's inevitable, right? Barring awful complications or something like that, or intervention, like, it's going to become a human. Therefore, it is a human, and you have no right to interfere in that. Like, you sure go give it up for adoption. I still think that's awful and all that stuff, but like the bare minimum of decency that should be applied, especially if you're going to apply this across your whole life and all of society, is for you to not kill that little thing. You have a duty to not make that happen.
Something you just said struck me, which is, barring some horrible accident or intervention, this will become a fully formed baby and human and life. And that the idea of the intervention made me think about how so many policies that people generally who support the pro-choice quote unquote position, a lot of them support the idea of things like reparations, where actions taken by people who you're related to, your forefathers, have impacted the inevitable outcome of another group of people. That's kind of their argument, right? Like, if white people hadn't um, brought slaves over from Africa, then they would have been rich and wealthy. And because they've been brought over to America and because of racist culture here, they are now subject to poverty and bad conditions. Therefore, it is our responsibility to pay these people because of the actions taken that have inevitably led to this conclusion. But they won't, they'll extrapolate this from, people who did things that you have no bearing on, you have no individual responsibility for, but they won't even put that kind of individual responsibility on someone who's performing an action that directly intervenes with someone's future, aka taking their life, right? If you don't actively intervene with a pregnancy, that will become a human baby, and it will become a human, and it will become an adult, and it will become a life that everyone would recognize has the right to life. But they're not willing to apply that logic of, because your forefathers intervened with a mass culture, you owe the descendants. They won't even put that kind of logic to the people performing abortions now, which is, you performed an abortion which directly intervenes with the future of that fetus, which it would inevitably leads to its death. They don't even hold themselves to a much shorter time preference and a much more direct link application, even though it's the exact same principle, except in this case, it's a lot more clear and a lot more direct and a lot more responsible. Okay, we'll move to our next take here. This one comes from Lo-Fi Republican, who's got this great profile picture of Diddy Kong, which just helps you take him seriously. Lo-Fi Republican tweets, Republicans love posting clips of John Fettermen drooling and crapping over himself and babbling incoherently as though it isn't the biggest self-own imaginable to constantly remind people how the GOP failed to produce a superior alternative to that. What are your thoughts on this?
I kind of go back and forth on it. I think it's a good take because it's pretty funny and it reveals something about the GOP that when I was thinking about this, I was thinking about how all the hate that like EA gets, right, for the
Yeah.
games that it produces. And it's like you got these old dudes in some boardroom thinking like, oh, we need to make another, mass multiplayer online game with a subscription and everything. It's like, no, we're all just want some single player awesome RPG to come out, right? Like that's all what we all want. And we wish someone that was actually a gamer would go in there and like set the direction of what type of games they'd produce and things like that. But the heads of EA are just so out of touch, and they're evaluating like what they build games off of completely different metrics than what actually produces awesome stuff that people want to buy. That is the GOP in a nutshell, right? Like they evaluate their candidates based on a set of attributes that are no longer relevant, are no longer actually compelling to people that want to vote. And I mean, their complete misunderstanding of why Trump became so awesome and so compelling and so attractive to people is case in point of that. And then, with I think it was it Oz that was against John Fettermen? Yeah. So you get this, man, it's like on the Republican paper of like 30 years ago, Dr. Oz looks pretty good, right? Like he's got the doctor in his title. He's a successful businessman. He speaks really well. He's kind of part of the elite or whatever. But it's like that doesn't resonate anymore with people. People with the age of the internet and people are able to see everything and people able to put their own opinions out there. And, it's kind of the age of the down to earth, honest person, or the person that can portray things the most honestly. And Oz is the complete opposite of that, right? He's like the Oprah favorite. He's the plastic guy, all that stuff. John Fettermen is the same. Don't get me wrong. He sucks. He's awful. The fact that like, the entire Democratic base would rather have someone like him is also pretty ridiculous. But it really, this whole thing kind of does show that the Republicans aren't able to produce a viable alternative or superior alternative that doesn't at least. I don't even know what you'd have to do to lose to John Fettermen except use Dr. Oz. I don't know if you saw some of the videos and stuff of him, going through like mispronouncing that grocery store's name and then talking about he didn't even call it a charcuterie board. He called it something else like that's a little bit more fancy. It's just like, man, it's so out of touch. So I like this take for that reason.
Yeah.
I just think it's leaving out the fact that Democrats will vote blue no matter who. And that's also that's a good thing to remind people of.
Yeah, no, I think that I have no problems with this take because I think it's one of those things where if you're a Republican, this is a self-own. If you're a Democrat, this is also a pretty big own, right? Just sharing anything of John Fettermen. And that's why if you are outside that paradigm, that's why this tweet works and makes sense and the bigger picture makes sense. It's the reason why Michael Malice always brings up John Fettermen. He is constantly bringing him up and he always says he's his choice for 2024. And and it's genuinely hilarious for it to be the Republicans thinking that it's such a great own to share these posts because it's like, yeah, you can make fun of him all you want and you lost. Like you could not come up with a more compelling message than this guy who can barely come up with a message out of his mouth, period, without going into a stroke-like babble syndrome. And I frankly, I think it's kind of absurd that, John Fetterman's in this position. Like he kind of like with Biden, where I feel to some degree, I feel sorry for them each because they're being used by people around them in many ways. And so it's kind of baffling that people aren't seeing this as kind of abusive in some respects. Now, obviously, they technically do have their own agency, so I get it, but it still is it still is kind of baffling there. But I think this take is correct because like you were saying with the out of touch nature of Dr. Oz. The other thing about Dr. Oz is even 30 years ago, if you looked at him, he would have been on the other side of the ticket. He would have been running as a
Yeah,
Democrat. All of
that's
his
really true.
positions are completely, and I would say that they're positions that are completely non-traditional for a Republican, not even in the Trump bucked the orthodoxy of Republicans kind of way, right? Trump bucked a lot of the GOP establishment trends, some ways good, some ways bad. You know, he was very good on trying to actually, you know, get well, allegedly, you know, get some of the bad people out there. He changed the narrative on foreign policy, which was great. Then he also changed some of the narrative on free trade, which was bad. And he was also pretty bad on gun rights and things like that.
Yeah.
But Dr. Oz was just bad in all of the ways that Trump didn't buck. Like, he was bad on healthcare. He's bad on the Second Amendment, like beyond what Trump was ever bad on. He was bad on taxing and just he was just a disaster candidate when it comes to connecting with anything that Republicans cared about, let alone with anything that anyone in Pennsylvania cared about. Because the thing is, like you mentioned, you know, Democrats will always vote blue. They will just vote for their guy no matter what. And for their attempts, it seems like the thought process was, we'll run this guy who's moderate, who will appeal to the Democrats, and there's no way they'll vote for this, you know, this guy who can't speak a sentence. But they hated Trump so much, and when you try to appeal to everybody, you appeal to nobody, and so no one wants to vote for Dr. Oz in that case. And you end up with a senator who really can't even give a full speech without trailing off into nonsense.
I agreed, and I think that it's also a huge cell phone on democracy, right? Like,
Yeah.
John Fettermen is proof that democracy doesn't work. You know, insert a chance of show me what democracy looks like. It looks like John Fettermen.
Yeah.
You know, Michael Malice posted that clip of him, you know, with his opening speech for the debate, and he's like, "Hey, good night." You know, it's like, oh my gosh, man.
Yeah.
Yeah, I feel really bad for the guy. You know, even though I think he's probably a pretty bad person. A lot of his, he's been kind of a leech on the system his entire life, and everything. But regardless, you know, he's kind of a pawn in this whole scheme to, you know, maintain, you know, a majority, or at least have somewhat control of the Senate by the Democrats. And they're willing to use a mentally handicapped guy that is obviously suffering to do that. So that's what democracy produces, right? Democracy is, it doesn't matter how many people we have to hurt. It doesn't matter that we're going to hurt someone that is actually really, really vulnerable, or that we're going to have someone that is mentally handicapped speaking for however many people, you know, live in his state, you know, several million, maybe tens of millions of people. And that's what democracy is, right? Like a simple majority vote, maybe even just the giving a middle finger to the red side of the aisle to put this guy in, results in this, you know, this bumbling idiot that can't speak a sentence without having an issue, having control over people's lives. And maybe that should make us question the entire system, where 51% gets to dictate what the other 49% do. And to be clear, I think the 51% have put someone in there that is to their own detriment, right? So it's really just to the detriment of everyone that lives in that state. And so I'm, you know, some people have an opinion. We've talked about him a few times already on this post, but Michael Malice's point of like, this reveals like how dumb our current system is, how bad it is. And so I like it in that way. It's a cell phone for the Republicans, cell phone for the Democrats, cell phone for democracy in general. And democracy isn't necessarily a good thing. And I hope people start thinking of it in a worse light.
I completely agree. Couldn't have said it better. Okay, we're moving on to another take from our favorite guest on this show, who's never been here, but we'd love to have him on, Joe Walsh. Joe Walsh tweets, "You want a third party? Me too. A fourth party? Me too. Open primaries? Maybe ranked choice voting? Me too. But not right now. Right now, our only job is to defeat Trump and Trumpism. Systemic reform can come later. I explain here." And then he links to his podcast episode there. What do you think?
Oh, I mean, it just reminds me of every bad argument against any good idea that's been made in the past, you know, however long, you know, a long time. They're like, oh, no, that's a good thing. We want to do it eventually. You know, we want to get out of Iraq. We want to get out of Afghanistan, but not now. You know, we need to make sure that these places are stable. We're not done bringing democracy here, you know, or oh yeah, we want to repeal this or repeal that tax. And but not yet. We got to do this. It's like it's called sunk cost fallacy, right? And it just Joe Walsh. I realized today because I wanted to look up when I saw you put this in here. I wanted to see what he explained there because I thought maybe it was a thread or whatever, so we could actually debunk more of his reasoning. But his Twitter handle is Walsh Freedom, and as a side note, it's like, well, there's nothing free about Joe Walsh. And this tweet particularly illustrates it because if you really were a freedom loving person, like you'd want as many people's voices to be heard. You'd want a Libertarian Party and a Green Party in there to mix it up because it might lead to some gridlock as well as more people having a better percentage of their voice being represented. But yeah, you don't love freedom. You just care about results, whether it's at the hand of the gun or it's by dictatorship and decree. Because he's so deranged about Trump, like he's willing to do those things and keep the third and fourth parties out. Even if Trump wasn't in there, he'd be talking about DeSantism or he'd be talking about Cruzism or whatever was on the other side of the duopoly. So he fully believes in that. He doesn't believe in multiple parties.
I was going to say that the entire thing that makes me laugh about this is the idea of saying, like, yeah, I want a third and a fourth party. I want more voices, but we have to shut out this voice.
Yeah.
and similar to what you were saying about the last take is this really is a pathetic excuse of why democracy is so goofy and why it doesn't work, because the whole idea and I don't want to dunk on Joe for the wrong reason. Like, I believe in free speech. I believe in free expression. I believe in taking all of the ideas and making sure that the best ones thrive and the worst ones don't. But that also means that there are ideologies that I am drastically opposed to. I don't want communism to be popular. I want it defeated. But the reason why this is so counterintuitive from Joe Walsh is because he's a big defender of democracy, and he's talking about expanding political options for democracy, specifically for the democratic purpose. And then he's saying, but we need this one ideology defeated. What do you think the purpose of opening choices is, if not to let more ideologies in, and including a very popular one like populist Trumpism? Again, whether or not it's right or wrong, these are entirely, you're saying, I want there to be opposition and multiple parties, but only controlled opposition and multiple parties that I'm okay with. The Overton window needs to be this big, and that's it. And so he's not really so democratic after all, is he?
It's just when people talk like this, like we need to defeat Trump and Trumpism, I can kind of understand like their conclusion of defeating Trump. But how are you going to defeat Trumpism when what was it? 75 million people voted for him in 2020. It's like, where are all those people going to go? What do you mean by defeat Trumpism when you say, when you realize there's maybe not even 75 million, let's just say half of the people, right, that voted for Trump are like enthusiastic or like Trump or would fall under this banner of Trumpism that he has. It's like, that's still 35, 37 million people. What do you mean by defeat them? It's like, they're not going to go away. It's not like when you defeat them, they just vanish like Thanos does in the Avengers series. Like, they're still there. They still have their opinions. And so, one, that's kind of a weird conclusion, maybe even scary. And two, it's not, you actually have to change their mind, right? And if you want to change their mind, you got to get other ideas out there, because obviously the ideas that you're presenting on one side of the aisle are not going to work. In a lot of ways, for me, I used to be pretty conservative. And I think in a lot of my moral values, I still really am. But in terms of like governmental structure and all those things, I'm libertarian / anarchist. And I came over to that because I started to realize there was a third option, right? Like I very well might have been a Trump-ish person in 2016 if I hadn't discovered, you shared with me Tom Woods and Dave Smith and all these libertarian guys, and they're like, oh, like this makes sense because it appealed to certain values of mine. That third voice was able to like mellow me out and draw me to something that has more moral base. If you really want to defeat Trumpism, you have to allow that discussion to happen. But in reality, what Joe Walsh is advocating for here is, well, I want a third party, but I want to take out one of the two parties right now and then replace it with that third party. And then we'll be back to two parties. Yep. So he just wants it to be, choosing between two brands of Heinz ketchup. He doesn't actually want to, add in a third type of condiment in there. It's just, that's a dumb analogy, but you get what I'm saying.
Yeah, no, it's totally right. And yeah, I was gonna say the only other aspect is what you already mentioned, which is the not right now is always the cry of the person who wants to engage in a policy completely opposite of what they're saying not right now is.
Yep.
Like, oh, we need to do this thing but not right now. Okay, you don't want to do it, you want to pretend that you want to do it, but you just need to push it out indefinitely. The people who come around on this, I've only ever seen come around and say we should have been out, I was wrong on this, not okay, now is the time to come out, we've been good to be here for X long, or we need this, we needed the policy not to be changed for those number of years, but now is the right time. Anyone who ever comes around on this says I was wrong, we needed this from the beginning. And I think about people who become anti-war later in life, or support more liberty policies, things like that. So yeah, just kind of a funny take here from our friend who Mr. Freedom.
Yeah.
Okay, our next take here comes from an exchange that has a few familiar names in it. So it starts with Senator Mike Lee, based Mike Lee on Twitter. Highly recommend you follow him. He's actually really fun because he generally tweets more of his actual thoughts, which is unique to politicians. So Mike Lee tweets, Putin's bad, but this isn't our war. And he tweets a link to an interview with him in Daily Caller. And former Representative Adam Kinzinger replies, weak man you are. So then Donald Kimball, I hear a very handsome and talented and charming individual, responds, I wish more men were like Adam Kinzinger. It takes real courage to be fully on board with insert latest thing and volunteer other people's kids to war. And then we have someone replying to me saying, there are no American kids in that war, drama queen. To which I responded, number one, well, I'm glad it's only American lives that matter. And two, the Pentagon Papers leaks showed that the UK Special Forces are involved, further likening the chance that US will have to have direct involvement, assuming the US isn't already part of this NATO Special Forces that were leaked. And then we have the goal shift of the century, which says, Putin can take his nonsense home. That's the bad guy. We're preventing additional genocide. We promised our support during denuclearization. Americans should stand by their word. We already screwed the Kurds. All right, what do you think about that take?
I couldn't believe that last tweet. I mean, the what is it? The age-old rule that Ukrainian flag in handle means NPC.
Yeah.
I mean that. You and I were talking about it before the show, but it was just this constant shifting of goalposts, and I'll let you address that part. But I just like, how have we not learned? How is this person aware enough to bring up the Kurds, but also dumb enough to not realize like all the lies, deception that accrued through that entire involvement in the Iraqi war? Scott Horton, who we've talked about on the show before, has a really great video series called Enough Already on YouTube. I think it's 7 or 9 videos, and it basically takes the history of the United States interventionism in the Middle East from the 1950s overthrow of the Shah in Iran all the way to present day. And it paints a really good narrative of how everything's gone, a lot of facts, all of it sourced, all this stuff. But I think it's episode 4 or 5. They're about 7-minute videos. Definitely should watch them. But episode 4 or 5, he talks about this instance where we actually, we're talking about the Kurds and how we had the ambassador's daughter saying, oh yeah, the Iraqis are going through and killing kids in the incubators and things like this. And it turned out that was all lies, right? And we also, when Saddam actually asked our diplomat, like, hey, I might go invade Kuwait, and we offered the most timid of reservations about that. In some like written down forms of that meeting, we actually encouraged and said we won't actually resist it, I'll go for it. And it was all an effort for us to go in there and mess with Saddam. And so what's crazy to me about that is like the entire Iraqi war was because we were playing games on both sides. We really wanted people to do certain things. And then, when we encouraged the Kurds and the Sunnis to rise up against Saddam, we kind of abandoned them to their own to be killed by Saddam Hussein. And then you think about Ukraine, right? Like we've been poking the bear in Russia for forever. We've been talking about putting Ukraine into NATO, and all these different things, pushing our NATO all the way up to the doorstep of Russia. And then, yeah, Russia's bad and they shouldn't invade Ukraine. But you also have to realize the position we put them in, right? You corner a dog. It's wrong for the dog to bite you, but it's also like I understand why the dog did that in the first place. And so, we are not standing by our ward. We've really just, basically said, hey, little guy, we've got your back, as we punch the big guy in the room and then point to the little guy, which is Ukraine. So, all this stuff is not good. We shouldn't be over there. It's actually strong for us to say, hey, the strongest person in the room is the person that advocates for peace and can make peace happen, not the person that encourages conflict.
So I think you've done a great overview of the most important aspects and context and reason why this take is bad. I'm going to go and nitpick all of the stupid semantic things about why it's wrong and why it's stupid and why this is the classic internet debate where you shift goalposts, where you use tricky wording and then ignore the actual points being made and in the original posts. So the first line, Putin can take his nonsense home. That's the bad guy. Okay, no one here said Putin was good. No one ever did. I believe, in fact, Mike Lee's entire tweet that started this says Putin is bad, but this isn't our war. So no one is saying Putin's good. So, okay, so your first point, completely irrelevant. And once again, you're reading into what you want to read. You say, because I disagree with your policy view here, you think that I think Putin's a great guy. No, Putin sucks. He's terrible. He's a mug, or he's a mug. Excuse me. He's a thug. Anyway, okay, so we're preventing additional genocide. We promised our support. This entire line here completely it completely shifts the goalposts, because the first thing that I said was that it takes courage to be on board with the latest thing and to volunteer other people's kids to war. And then her claim was there are no American kids in that war. And so then I challenged that idea by saying that, well, the UK special forces are there, because even to start with, her saying there are no American kids in that war does not invalidate my first point either, because I just said you're volunteering other people's kids into war. That doesn't necessarily only mean American lives, although that could be assumed. So I understand where she's coming from there. But I highlighted why American kids are very likely to be in the war. The Pentagon Papers showed that our U.S. involvement is extremely close to being involved if we aren't already. There are special forces from NATO, most likely American weapons and personnel over there carrying out actual military operations. I believe that was in the leaks. I couldn't, last night when this happened, I couldn't actually find a direct citation that U.S. stuff was, but I could find that the UK stuff was, and then there were implied U.S. forces in the NATO, which is why I didn't directly say, yes, there are U.S. soldiers directly over there, although it is very likely the case. And you can't see it in this post, but I did link the full article that talked about the UK special forces and the NATO special forces that are there. So anyway, so I answer back saying basically, well, no, but there probably are U.S. troops there actually, and we are very likely to be involved. And then the next line from her is, we're preventing additional genocide. So she goes from saying there's no American kids there to saying, well, even if we are, it's the right thing to do. So again, shifting goalpost, completely disregarding the actual point that's being made. And then lastly, let's talk about why she once again is saying that Americans need to stand by their word. We screwed the Kurds, using these examples of stuff. But in none of those examples is she refuting the idea that you're still volunteering other people's kids to war in every situation, which is the entire point of why I think that this is a terrible idea. She's saying we promised our support during denuclearization. Americans should stand by their word. Nothing. The U.S. government may have, but like you pointed out, the U.S. government propped them up and prodded them into aggression to begin with in the first place. So it's entirely disingenuous for her to say, Americans should stand by their word. No. The Americans who made these promises, even if you're talking about a noble promise here, It was the government. And once again, the government is the one who is volunteering other kids to war. So essentially, my point is saying, hey, it's not brave to volunteer as the government other people's kids to war. And then she says, the government volunteered other people's kids to war, so they need to stand by their word. So she's just repeating my point, but not saying why it's a good thing. And so she tacitly admits I'm correct here without realizing it, in kind of a self-own. But again, it's not obvious to her. I didn't end up replying because it was midnight, and I'm like, you know what, I've got better things to do, like sleep, and I'll just
we can just address it on the show.
Yeah, exactly. So it's pretty funny that she points out that Americans did make that promise, but it was just American governments promising other people's kids to war, like I just said. So okay, we'll move on to our last post here. This one is a video post from another podcast. This is being shared around because of the news today that Tucker Carlson has in fact been let go from Fox, although they worded it as they parted. I'm pretty sure it blindsided Tucker as well. So anyway, so we're going to watch this video and see what Tucker Carlson said.
I've spent my whole life in the media. My dad was in the media. Like, that is a big part of the revelation that's changed my life, is the media are part of the control apparatus. Like, there's no, I know. Cause you're younger and smarter and you're like, yeah. But what if you're me and you spent your whole life in that world, and to look around and all of a sudden you're like, oh, wow. Not only are they part of the problem, but I spent most of my life being part of the problem, defending the Iraq war. Like, I actually did that. Can you imagine if you did that?
Well, what do you think? What is one of your biggest regrets in your career?
Oh, defending the Iraq war.
That is it?
Well, I've had a million regrets, not being more skeptical, calling people names when I should have listened to what they were saying. Look, when someone makes a claim, there's only one question that's important at the very beginning, which is the claim true or not? So I say, you committed murder, or you rigged the last election. Before you attack me as a crazy person for saying that, maybe you should explain whether you did it or not. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
And for too long, I participated in the culture where I was like, anyone who thinks outside these pre-prescribed lanes is crazy, is a conspiracy theorist. And I just really regret that. I'm ashamed that I did that. And partly it was age, partly it was the world that I grew up in. So when you look at me and you're like, yeah, of course they're part of the means of control, I'm like, that's obvious to you because you're 28, but I just didn't see it at all. And I'm ashamed of that.
Isn't that what the media tries to do, though?
It's their only purpose.
Right.
They're not here to inform you. Really? Even on the big things that really matter, like the economy and war and COVID and like things that really matter that will affect you. No, their job is not to inform you. They are working for the small group of people who actually run the world. They're their servants. They're their Praetorian Guard. And we should treat them with maximum contempt because they have earned it. Like,
all right. What do you think about that take? There's obviously 2 minutes there, so a lot to take in, but break down what stood out to you.
That was so based. How old is Tucker?
I feel like he's got to be in his 40s or something.
60, he's 53 years old. So
53. Okay.
I think that, everything he said in there was really, really good. I particularly liked the bit about if someone says anything, the first thing you should evaluate is the first question that matters is it true? Yeah. I remember at my startup, we had this thing about that governed how we talk to each other and as well as to people outside of our organization, which is before you say anything, the first thing that matters is it true? If it's not true, then you don't say it. The second thing that matters is it kind? And then if it's not kind, you ask yourself, is it necessary? And if it's necessary, if it's true and it's necessary, then you can say it, right? The best thing that happens is when it's true, kind, and necessary. So I really like that he was saying that because I think that's missing from a lot of our discourse. And I think a lot of the algorithm in social media, as well as just the way that media in general operates, is truth is kind of at the back burner. And the first thing that matters is whether or not it makes money and gets eyeballs and things like that. So things that are really salacious or really extreme make it out there, even if they're not true. The other part that kind of struck me was just like, he was like, oh, it just wasn't clear to me. Where for you and I, it's kind of been clear. It's been clear to me for at least a decade that the media manipulates. And maybe that comes with us growing up with maybe it comes with us being participants in manipulation, right? Like I think about your, when we were doing Cringe Post, how you made that edit of yourself with the black and white rain things or whatever.
Yeah,
And I think about myself, like I would take pictures all the time. Like I had the little Love Is photo thing that I was trying to do. And like I'd take all these pictures and edit them to make them look good. And I think when you grow up with the realization of how you can manipulate things from what they actually are to make it appealing to a mass audience, because you participate in that, you also can recognize when it's being done to you. And I think that's why we recognize that. Whereas people like Tucker, or people like our parents, generation and stuff that didn't grow up with these things, it's harder for them to recognize that until it's explained in a certain way.
yeah. I was so pleased, in particular, with that closing line where he just goes off, and you're like,
Yeah.
oh my goodness, that is incredibly based. Um, the thing that really sticks out to me too is the fact that so much of this isn't even implicit in what he says, but so much of the sort of judgment of someone's views and their what they're sharing and what they're doing in the current era, we lack background for that. And so it's like, I could have looked up Tucker's entire history and the fact that his father was in the media, he was in the media, all that kind of stuff. Um, but there is something powerful to hearing about, oh yeah, that is his world. That is what he was used to. And so for him to come out and have the total paradigm shift, I think that is pretty powerful, because it shows that he's not someone who's bought into that system. That's been his life. It would have been so easy for him to say, oh, to have that wake up moment and then look the other way. He's successful in this business. He's successful at defending the Iraq war, promoting the regime, talking points. It's hard to go against the grain, and he'd been rewarded for it, but even now he's being punished for it, but he's not back. He's not going to back down from that. And so I think there's something incredibly powerful about that. And then learning that, people coming from one place or thought process or one person of who they are in one point of time to where they are now, that's a journey. And so when someone gives a perspective that maybe you don't disagree with, like these takes, I never want to actually criticize most of the people unless they're actively harming people, that I would argue many politicians are. But the people can change. People can change their mind. They can become awakened, and you don't know what their entire worldview looks like. And so for Tucker's case here, his entire worldview was the media and what the media promoted, and he came out of that, and he was able to wake up, and it blew his mind, but he came out and made the hard choice to follow the truth, even though that's a tough choice to make. And so I just think that's really, really admirable, and it was really a striking point.
And I think we've kind of mentioned it a couple times on this show, but like true change produces like pretty, not hard line, but pretty distinct, like 360, right, on these issues. It's like, hey, I not only am I no longer like anti-Iraq war, but my regret of supporting the Iraq war has led me to understand why I should regret supporting the Iraq war, which means now I have a completely different shift in my mindset. And when I say I mean Tucker, about whether I support Ukraine or any other foreign conflict, right? Like that principle, like the change was driven by principle, and the realization of why you're wrong was driven by principle. And now that principle has been fully integrated into your belief system and how you evaluate things in the world, which is what produces someone like Tucker Carlson saying, what he says today. I don't agree with him on a lot of stuff. I think he's fairly protectionist in some ways, in a lot of his stuff. But like in general, the guy seems to be principally driven, which makes for an awesome show. And it's why he's got had the number one cable news network show, which is, it's insane, right? That like, hey, you got the number one cable news network show in America by a long shot. Let's fire the guy.
Yeah.
It's just kind of crazy. Makes you realize there's something else going on.
Yeah. Well, and when you're talking about the different things that, like he's protectionist on, and I don't like those things. There are things that I have serious complaints about with his views, but then also recognizing again where he's coming from. Like, I get it. You're coming from a place that is very difficult to rationalize, that that he would flip a switch and then become fully Austro-economic, laissez-faire, bright child. I don't think that it's realistic to expect all that. And so I'm still going to disagree. I'm still going to call out with that, but I also have to recognize and respect the actual stuff that he has done, that has been good, and where he's come from to get to that point. So I think this was an amazing call out. And this podcast happened not that long before he's gotten canned. So
Wow. Yeah.
Probably not the straw that broke the camel's back. I would probably guess the lawsuit did, but I think they probably wanted to get rid of him for a while, and that was just the excuse they needed.
Yeah.
All right. Well, thank you so much for tuning in to this week's episode. We appreciate it. Make sure to like and share. All that good stuff helps us out a ton. If you find any takes that you want us to critique, we're happy to. Just send them our way, and we'll catch you on the next one. Take care.